Well, fellas, many of you have requested an aiming guide for battleships from me for quite some time and even quite recently. So, here it is. I hope you enjoy. So, I do consider myself to be an above average player when it comes to battleships and things with big guns and World of Warships. While I'm far from a crack shot, I can usually get my shells to land on target. So I certainly have the information that will certainly get you going in the right direction. A lot of aiming in World of Warships comes with experience with the game and such, so that is a very large part of it, and we'll talk about that when we get into it. But anyway, the video is cut up into chapters. We're going to talk about how to get your HUD set up. We're going to talk about the shells and the physics behind them. Then we're going to get into, of course, the aiming guide with how to aim, and then some tips and tricks there at the end. So you can check out the timeline down below if you want to bounce around to a certain portion. Have at it. So, before we get going, if you do find this video helpful, informational, or entertaining, make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, all that jazz helps out on the YouTube side of things. But now, into the aiming guide. So, let's talk about getting your game set up correctly. So, your HUD, your heads-up display, all that information on screen, there's a couple of things you most certainly need to have up. So, information is key. Let's get all of it. Set your HUD to full. You can do this by going into the game menus. You should be seeing the clip pop up on screen right now. Just follow this. You go to HUD, you go to alternative interface, and you click that down to full. That will give you the full amount of information up on your screen, which you do need. The most important things that it will put up right at the middle of your crosshair is the travel time for your shells, distance to your target, and your firing penalty range. Now, while yes, you can kind of get all of this from information elsewhere on screen, I like having all of it be nice and close together so you can refer to that rather than having to look at like the target ship for the distance and trying to guesstimate again how long it's going to take your shells to get there. Primarily the travel time of your shells is the most important thing that you do need, but again, having all these right there is just nice, and I do like that, and it will help you out, especially if like you're in something like a heavy cruiser that's in smoke, because while a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about pertains to battleships, if you do have like any of the cruisers in game that have larger guns, this can help out as well. So I will be referring to them from time to time, hence again the smoke firing penalty, because usually in a battleship when you're in smoke, doesn't really matter. Your smoke firing penalty is so great you're going to get spotted, but you may not. Who knows? So anyway, the next question I get asked a lot is what sight to use. Well, you see, fellas, the sight you see on screen, I've been using this sucker for 7 years. This is just the default sight. It's worked for me for this time. If you have a sight that you like, go for it. There's plenty of to choose from in game. The standard reticle has again worked for me for quite some time. It's very simple, very easy to use. Again, I know there's a lot of options in game. You might hear someone talk about one reticle, another one talk about another reticle. If you want to try it out and see what works for you, go for it. But again, as far as I'm concerned, the standard one, I've been using it for again almost over half a decade now in this game, and it works fine for me. So that's the HUD out of the way. Real short, sweet, and simple. All right, let's talk about shells and physics and stuff. So shells, yeah, each nation and even the various ships in that nation's battleship line, they all have their own flavor. So knowing this is important, obviously. U.S. battleships, for example, their shells are heavy and slow. That gives them bad air drag coefficient, which means that at range they slow down a lot, and they are almost traveling in reverse when they get to the target ship, which of course leads to you having to aim, longer, not aim longer, but lead longer at distance and such. Soviet battleship shells, they have fast shells with good air drag coefficients, and they have flat arcs, unlike the American battleships, darn near rainbow arcs, which means you have great penetrating power at close range. You don't have to lead targets as long at longer ranges. So knowing how your ship's shells work is half of the battle when it comes to aiming. And this guide will cover the basics of aiming. you are going to have to, of course, compensate on how your individual ship performs. I mean, just looking at, again, the American battleship tech line, you go from the North Carolina with the shorter 45 caliber guns, then you go to the Iowa with the 50 caliber guns. That gives you a little bit more velocity out the barrel, and again, more velocity at range. So you don't have to aim quite as far ahead of your target with the Iowa as you do with the North Carolina. And that's just from Tier 8 to Tier 9 in one battleship tech tree. So knowing this information is quite important. Now, how do you find this out? There's a couple ways you can do it. You can go to a third-party website like Ship Tools. All this information is there. A lot of this information is not present in-game. That's what Saturday's video was about. You can look up that information there, or if you want to get more of like a hands-on practical experience, the training room is completely free to use. It costs you nothing to go into the training room. You do not expend any signal flags. You do not have to pay any credits to use the training room. It's great for experimenting with your ship's guns, so most definitely use it. You can even populate it with bots, and these bots can be active. They can be sailing around, they can be shooting back at you, or they can just be sitting there doing nothing. And again, it's completely free to use. Great for experimenting and learning your ship's guns, or getting a bit more of a better feel for your ship's guns before you go out into battle. You can see what the arcs are, you can see how, slow they are at range, or maybe how fast they are at range. We're talking about the Soviet battleships, so most definitely use the training room. Alright, so let's get into the basics of aiming now. Leading your target, so this is how far ahead or behind you have to lead your target. So after you lock onto a target automatically or by aiming at a target and pressing X on your keyboard, you now have to determine how far to lead your target. There are two parts to this. One, how fast they're going, or what direction they're heading in also, and two, how long your shells will take to get there. To determine roughly how fast your target ship is going, there's a couple of indicators to look for. One, the bow wake will build up as the ship accelerates. That is that white sea foam, if you will, that builds up at the front portion of the target ship. Or if they are traveling in reverse, it does get a little bit of a buildup at the stern. And two, the smoke from the ship's smokestack. The smokestack is probably the easiest one to notice in most cases, but in cases where ships are either bow on to you or at an angle where the smoke flow isn't clear, the bow wake is the next best thing to go off of. So obviously, as you're looking at these two indicators, the smokestack, if they are, of course, full ahead, you'll see that the smokestack is, well, not the smokestack, but the smoke coming out of the smokestack is, of course, trailing behind the ship, flowing in the opposite direction that the ship is moving in. It's also a good indicator to see what they're doing with their rudder, because as they slow down, the smoke will obviously react to that. So if they're going full steam ahead and then they pump the brakes, the smoke flow will cut from being, of course, trailing way behind the ship to shrinking to, maybe getting to like the mid portion of its origin point, and then obviously they're going in reverse, it's going to flow in the other way. So watching that and seeing what the smoke is doing is a good indicator of what direction and how fast this ship is going in. And again, with the bow wake, if they're going slow, they're going to have a small wake. As they go faster, it's going to build up. And again, when they go in reverse, it will obviously not be present, and the ship will have a nice little stern wake when it's going in reverse. So watching these things will give you a good indication of what direction the ship is going in. You also look at the minimap. Obviously the icon will move appropriately on the minimap, but it only moves every so often because of the scale of the minimap. So again, look at the smoke, look at the shell, look at the shell wake, look at the bow wake. So once you have a rough idea of how fast and what direction the ship is traveling in, you now have to adjust according to your travel time of your shells. Again, some shells are faster, some are slower, so you have to take that into consideration. If you have slower shells, you'll obviously have to lead the target even more. If you have faster shells, you need to lead them less. This is where that timer comes in that you turned on in the HUD section. If you see it's going to take your shells 8 seconds to get to the target ship, then you need to anticipate where they're going to be at in 8 seconds, or how far ahead of the ship do you need to send your shells, because once your shells leave your ship, well, you can't aim anymore, so you need to adjust appropriately. So again, with like the American battleships, with their slower shells at range, you tend to have to lead the target ship almost double the distance you do when you're using ships that have faster and more consistent shells, again, like Soviet battleships. Obviously, with the Soviet battleships, especially with something like the Slava, you won't have to lead your targets that much at range. because of how fast these shells are. So again, gotta know your ship's parameters. All right, next up is vertical aim. So you're getting them aimed appropriately as far as ahead or astern goes. So now let's talk about up and down. So adjusting your vertical aim can be a bit tricky. If a target is sailing broadside to you in a perfectly straight line, it's very easy to blast them. But most players do tend to touch their A and D keys from time to time. So vertical aim is mostly prediction. I usually wait a second if I catch someone maneuvering and see if I can predict their movements. I do this by watching how they have been maneuvering for the last couple of seconds, see if I can pick up on a pattern, and then fire at where I think their ship will be in the next however many seconds my shells take to get there. Even if a ship is sailing broadside to you, wait a second and see if your crosshair drifts up or down, because you never know. It might look like they're sailing perfectly broadside, but they might be slightly angled in or slightly angled out. If your crosshair drifts upward, aim down slightly and then let your shells rip. And reverse that from when your crosshairs drift down. Also, the dot on the map can help you ensure your aim point is right on the middle of your target ship. Just make sure the dot is nice and even on your target ship on the mini-map. Then let the shells rip. Obviously, the idea is to hit your target citadel when in a battleship. Now, of course, not every ship is the same, but you generally want to hit in the central part of your target, right around the waterline. Again, obviously some ships have, different armor schemes than others, so you won't always get a citadel hit if you aim right in the center, but you will more than likely get the biggest chunk of damage ripped off of your target. Now, yet again, while yes, you do want to aim right around the waterline, every ship has slightly different firing arcs, or, in most cases, they're either flat or they're either, more, again, rainbowy. So depending on your ship, you might need to aim just above or just below the waterline depending upon what your arcs are like at whatever range you are firing at. Yet again, as an example, American battleships have great plunging fire at range and can often bully ships with weak deck armor like German battleships. So you actually want to hit the deck armor at range if you can when it comes to American battleships. But again, I can't stress this enough. It's learning your ship, learning your shell arcs, learning how your shells perform, and then taking that knowledge and using it as you are playing the game. So bow-in targets, though. Bow-in targets can be tricky to deal with, but generally switch to HE. If you switch to HE with battleship caliber guns, you more than likely have enough HE pin to just pin their bow armor. So if you're just trying to pin their bow with your HE, you can usually just aim under the bow if they're sailing toward you. Again, how much you'll have to aim under the bow is going to depend upon what range they're at. If they're, just a handful of kilometers away from you, you can probably aim right at the bow and you'll hit them. If they're like 10-ish kilometers away from you, again, I'm just speaking in general-ish terms, right? You should aim a little bit underneath their bow and you'll probably hit their bow just fine with your HE shells. And if they're, coming full steam at you, you should aim a little bit underneath their bow, and the HE shells will probably actually hit the deck armor and pin the deck armor, and probably set some fires too in the process. Now, obviously, if you have guns that can overmatch their bow armor, again, with the AP, just aim right underneath their bow, and usually, maybe again, depending upon, what ship it is, how fast it is, you might have to aim a little bit like in the water in front of them, and by the time their ship gets there, your AP will hit the bow, penetrate the bow, and you get that nice, juicy damage. Again, this all depends on range and what direction the target is sailing in. Is it sailing towards you? Is it sailing away from you? You're allowed to take multiple shots, You don't have to be Chris Kyle and dev strike your target on the first shot. You're allowed to take a shot and then adjust your aim appropriately. Again, take into account your shells, what direction the enemy ship is moving in, how fast they're moving, and how they're maneuvering and all that jazz. Also, if you wish to keep AP loaded in case anyone pops up broadside, which is obviously something a lot of battleship players like to do, aiming at the target ship's turrets if they're sailing toward you will generally get your shells to land somewhere in the ship's superstructure area, but superstructures can of course get saturated, so if you do manage to land some shells in the superstructure and you just get a bunch of overpins and such, obviously, go ahead, load up the HE and burn them down. You're allowed to shoot HE as a battleship. It's perfectly legal, but don't be one of those fellas in like a Yami spamming HE at everybody. That just absolutely hurts my soul at that point. So we're about to get into some tips and tricks, but that is it for the general aiming guide portion. Again, fellas, a lot of it is simply knowing your guns, knowing your shells, and knowing how they worked and all their parameters and such, and getting experience with them. So playing the game again and getting that experience and getting that knowledge is a huge part of the battle, but with what I've told you here, you should be able to get going in the right direction. Now for some tips. So once you fire, you can click Z on your keyboard to follow your shells. This is great if you're having to fire at some target that is behind an island. You'll see me do this all the time. You know, I'll try to line up my shot as best I can with my little aiming circle on the mini map and the enemy ship's icon, and then I'll let a salvo go. I'll follow the shells to the target and see where the shells land and then adjust accordingly. Another thing, blind firing. Blind firing is something that can be done when ships are in like smoke and they're HE spamming you. I know that's super annoying for battleship players because, well, that's incredibly annoying to have a ship that's burning down a good chunk of your HP and they're sitting in a smoke screen and, well, seemingly not risking anything. But fellas, when the ships aren't spotted, they are still there. So when you do have a destroyer that's HE spamming you in smoke, if you know the turret layout of that destroyer, which you can learn by just looking at where the shells are coming from the smoke, there's a ship there. So you can kind of guesstimate where the ship is at and, you know, let your shells rip, and you might get, you know, a shell or two, which sometimes is scary enough to have them shut up and they'll start running away. You might even sink the fella. He might be down to his last, you know, 1,200, 2,000 bits of HP, and you very well might sink him. So you can get better at that, and be surprised how often that does work. But again, you know, you just kind of follow what their turrets are doing in the smoke, because if it's something like in like a Harugamo with a reload build, right, you know, they're firing every second or something, a second and change, so you kind of get like an updated thing about where their ship is at. Now granted, you won't be locked on and your shells won't be all that accurate, but when we're talking about destroyers, and again, like late game, you really only need to land a shell or two to really ruin their day. So don't be afraid to do that as well, my guys. So a challenge with sap to shoot sap at everything, because you guys get sap, and unless you can like 100% citadel somebody, just fire sap. Like just keep it loaded. Again, unless you're like 2 kilometers away and you know you can citadel with your AP, keep sap loaded. You guys have it really easy when it comes to ammunition selection. So guys, that is it for my aiming guide video. Let me know in the comments down below. Well, what would you add to the video? Did I leave anything out? What are some other tips and tricks for newer players that are trying to learn the ropes of the game? So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope this is helpful to you newer guys out there, and maybe some of you older guys that weren't exactly sure how any of this stuff worked. But again, if you did enjoy, make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, all of that jazz. Hope you guys are having a wonderful Wednesday, a wonderful rest of your week. Hope to catch you guys in the next one.